Think you know everything about Sally Field's habit-wearing, airborne antics? Think again. From pregnancy scandals hidden behind religious props to suicidal show Rejection that launched an Oscar career, the Flying Nun's behind-the-scenes secrets are more outrageous than Sister Bertrille's impossible physics. Discover the truth about cranes, cornets, and career-crushing depression that made this holy show a heavenly nightmare for its star. Fact 1. Sally Field got pregnant to escape. Sally Field has openly admitted that she deliberately got pregnant during the third season of The Flying Nun because she desperately wanted out of the show, and pregnancy seemed like her only escape route from what she considered a career-damaging role. Field felt so trapped by her contract and so miserable with the ridiculous premise that she saw having a baby as her ticket to freedom from the cornet and the constant jokes about flying nuns. The timing couldn't have been worse for the show's producers at Screen Gems. Here was their lead actress, playing a celibate nun who was supposed to be light enough to fly away in a stiff breeze, suddenly showing up to work with a very noticeable baby bump. The whole concept of the Flying Nun depended on Sister Bertrille being 90 pounds and aerodynamically perfect, so a pregnant nun created an impossible situation that threatened to destroy the show's already thin premise. The production team had to get creative with some pretty desperate measures to hide Field's growing belly throughout the 1968 to 1969 season. They used props and furniture strategically placed in front of her, shot her from the chest up whenever possible, and relied heavily on long shots featuring her stunt double for any flying sequences. Field later described herself as a walking sight gag during this period, saying you could only imagine what a pregnant flying nun looked like on screen. The whole situation highlighted just how much Field hated being trapped in what she considered a silly, career-limiting role, and her willingness to use pregnancy as an escape plan shows how far she was willing to go to get away from Sister Bertrille's habit. Fact 2. Another actress already started filming. Before Sally Field ever put on the Flying Nun's habit, another actress named Ron Troop had already been cast as Sister Bertrille and had actually started filming the pilot episode for The Flying Nun. Troop, who was Screen Gems' second choice for the role, was well into production when the entire situation took a dramatic turn that would change television history. The casting drama began when Sally Field initially turned down the role of the Flying Nun, finding the concept ridiculous and fearing it would damage her career after her positive experience with Gidget. With Field refusing the part, the producers at Screen Gems moved forward with their backup plan and hired Ron Troop to play the airborne sister. Troop began learning her lines, working with the other cast members, and filming scenes for what would become the pilot episode of the series. However, Field's stepfather, Jock Mahoney, who was a former Hollywood stuntman, intervened and essentially scared Field into reconsidering her decision. Mahoney warned his stepdaughter that if she turned down this opportunity, she might never work in show business again, which was enough to make the young actress change her mind about wearing the cornet. When Field finally agreed to take the role, Screen Gems made the brutal decision to fire Troop immediately, even though she had already invested time and effort into bringing Sister Bertrille to life. Field later admitted she felt devastated when she found out that someone else had already started working on the show, but by that point, the contracts were signed and the habit was hers to wear for the next 3 years. Fact 3. Directors treated Field like a prop. Sally Field experienced deeply humiliating treatment from the various directors who worked on The Flying Nun, with some treating her more like a piece of equipment than a human being during the demanding flying sequences. Field has spoken openly about being subjected to what she described as a parade of episodic television directors who showed her no respect as a performer, and one particular director even physically grabbed her shoulders and moved her into position as if she were nothing more than a prop on the set. The flying scenes required Field to be suspended from cranes and other mechanical equipment to create the illusion that Sister Bertrille was actually airborne, which was already a physically challenging and potentially dangerous part of the job. Instead of treating these sequences with the care and professionalism that such technical work demanded, many of the rotating directors seemed to view Field as just another piece of equipment that needed to be positioned correctly for the shot. This dehumanizing treatment was particularly painful for Field because she was still a young actress trying to establish herself in Hollywood after her previous success with Gidget. Being physically manipulated and treated without basic respect by directors who should have been guiding her performance added to her already deep unhappiness with the role and the show's ridiculous premise. The experience was so traumatic that Field has mentioned it repeatedly in interviews over the years, highlighting how the poor treatment she received from these directors contributed to her growing desire to escape from the Flying Nun and pursue more serious acting opportunities. It was actually her co-star, Madeline Sherwood, who encouraged Field to enroll in acting classes during her evenings and weekends, helping her develop the skills that would eventually lead to her acclaimed dramatic career. Fact 4. Visible wires in opening credits. If you watch The Flying Nun's opening credits carefully, you can actually see a wire holding Sally Field up during one of the most memorable sequences, completely giving away the show's low-budget special effects and ruining the magical illusion that Sister Bertrille could actually fly. The embarrassing mistake happens during the scene where Sister Bertrille is being dragged along by a dog, and the wire is clearly visible to anyone who knows where to look, making it obvious that Field is being supported by mechanical assistance rather than supernatural flying abilities. This technical blunder in the opening credits is particularly significant because these sequences were supposed to establish the show's fantastical premise and draw viewers into the world where a 90-pound nun could take flight whenever the wind caught her cornet just right. Instead, the visible wire immediately reveals the behind-the-scenes reality that everything viewers were seeing was created through basic television trickery and physical support systems. The mistake also highlights the rushed and budget-conscious production methods that Screen Gems used for The Flying Nun, where quality control apparently didn't extend to carefully checking the opening credits that millions of viewers would see every single week. In an era before digital effects and sophisticated post-production techniques, television shows relied on practical effects like wires, cranes, and clever camera angles to create impossible scenarios, but those methods only worked when they remained completely hidden from the audience. The fact that this obvious technical error made it into the final version of the opening credits and stayed there throughout the show's entire 3-year run demonstrates just how little attention to detail went into the production. And it serves as a perfect example of the kind of corner cutting that Sally Field found so frustrating about her experience on the series. Fact 5. Real Gidget footage used as flashback. In one particularly creative example of budget-saving recycling, The Flying Nun producers used actual footage from Sally Field's previous television series Gidget to create what appeared to be Sister Bertrille's personal home movies from her teenage years before joining the convent. The episode featured Sister Bertrille looking at old film footage of herself as a young woman, but instead of shooting new scenes or hiring a younger actress to play the character's past, the production team simply pulled clips from Field's earlier show and presented them as if they were home movies of Elsie Etherington's pre-nun life. This creative reuse of existing footage was both a clever cost-cutting measure and a way to establish continuity between Field's 2 major television roles, even though the characters were supposed to be completely different people living in entirely separate fictional worlds. Gidget was a California surfer girl dealing with typical teenage problems, while Sister Bertrille was a novice nun in Puerto Rico who could fly when the wind caught her cornet. So using footage from one show to represent the other character's backstory created some interesting logical inconsistencies. The decision to recycle Gidget footage also highlights how Screen Gems was looking for ways to maximize their investment in Sally Field while keeping production costs as low as possible during The Flying Nun's run. Rather than spending money on flashback sequences or hiring additional actors to play younger versions of characters, the producers found a way to use material they already owned and had sitting in their archives. For viewers who had watched both shows, seeing Gidget footage presented as Sister Bertrille's memories would have been immediately recognizable, creating a strange metafictional moment where Sally Field's previous television persona was literally woven into her current character's personal history. Fact 6. Cornet based on real religious order. The distinctive winged headpiece that gave Sister Bertrille her flying abilities was actually based on a real piece of religious clothing called a cornet that was worn by the Daughters of Charity, a Catholic religious order founded by St. Vincent de Paul in the mid-17th century. However, the Flying Nun never explicitly stated that Sister Bertrille belonged to this particular order, creating a historical inaccuracy that made her costume choice seem random rather than authentic to any specific religious community. The cornet itself was a large, heavily starched piece of white cloth that was folded upward in such a way as to create the resemblance of horns or wings on the wearer's head, which is where the French word cornes meaning horns comes from. The Daughters of Charity had worn this distinctive headpiece for centuries as part of their traditional habit, making them one of the most easily recognizable religious orders in the world because of their unique appearance. What makes this particularly interesting is that the Daughters of Charity actually stopped wearing the cornet in 1964, just 3 years before The Flying Nun premiered on television. This means the show was using a piece of religious clothing that had recently been abandoned by the very order that made it famous, essentially turning an outdated religious garment into a comedic prop for a fantasy television series. The show's creators chose the cornet specifically because its wing-like shape made it visually believable that wind could catch it and lift a small person into the air, but they never bothered to research or acknowledge the real religious significance behind this distinctive piece of clothing. This created a strange situation where Sister Bertrille was wearing the habit of a religious order she didn't belong to, living in a convent that followed different rules and traditions. Fact 7. 2 different actors played same character. The character of Father Lundigan, a psychiatrist who appeared in multiple episodes of The Flying Nun, was played by 2 completely different actors with drastically different personalities and acting styles, yet the show never acknowledged this casting change or explained why the character seemed like an entirely different person when he returned. In his first appearance, Father Lundigan was portrayed by John Astin, who was known for his quirky and somewhat eccentric acting style from his role as Gomez Addams in the Addams Family television series. However, when Father Lundigan returned in a later season, the role had been recast with Paul Lynde, a comedian famous for his distinctively sarcastic delivery and campy persona that he brought to shows like Bewitched and The Hollywood Squares. The personality difference between Astin's version of the character and Lynde's interpretation was so dramatic that viewers might have wondered if they were watching the same person at all, since Lynde's trademark wit and sharp comedic timing created a completely different version of the supposedly same psychiatrist. This type of unexplained recasting was not uncommon in 1960s television, where actors often appeared in multiple roles across different episodes or had their characters recast without any acknowledgement from the writers or producers. The practice was usually driven by scheduling conflicts, budget considerations, or simply the availability of different actors when it came time to bring back recurring characters for additional episodes. What makes this particular casting change so notable is the stark contrast between John Astin's more subdued, quirky approach to the character and Paul Lynde's flamboyant, scene-stealing presence that made Father Lundigan seem like he had undergone a complete personality transplant during his time away from the convent. Fact 8. Sister almost shot down by military. During one of her airborne adventures, Sister Bertrille was nearly shot down by military personnel who mistook her for an enemy aircraft, creating one of the most absurd situations in the entire series and highlighting just how ridiculous the show's premise could become when taken to its logical extreme. This incident demonstrates how the writers occasionally pushed the Flying Nun concept into genuinely dangerous territory, where Sister Bertrille's supernatural ability to fly could have resulted in serious military consequences rather than the usual lighthearted mishaps that characterized most episodes. The scenario reveals the bizarre reality that would exist if a flying nun actually operated in the real world, where military radar operators and pilots would have no way to distinguish between a small religious figure floating through the air and a potential aerial threat that needed to be neutralized. In the context of the 1960s, when the show was produced during the height of the Cold War, the idea of unidentified flying objects being treated as hostile targets was a very real concern for military forces around the world. This particular plot point also shows how the Flying Nun occasionally ventured into darker comedy territory, where the implications of Sister Bertrille's flying ability could lead to genuinely life-threatening situations rather than the harmless adventures that usually filled each episode. The fact that military personnel would logically view a flying human as a security threat adds an element of real-world consequences to what was otherwise a completely fantastical premise. The incident serves as a perfect example of how the show's writers sometimes explored the more serious ramifications of having a person who could actually fly, even though most episodes focused on using Sister Bertrille's abilities to solve community problems and help the people around the convent in Puerto Rico. Fact 9. Field refused press interviews and memorized lines. Last minute. Sally Field's hatred of the Flying Nun became so intense that she actively sabotaged her own career by refusing to do press interviews and developing what she later described as a bad reputation in Hollywood, while also admitting that she despised the script so much that she would only memorize her lines right before filming each scene. This unprofessional behavior was completely out of character for Field, who had been enthusiastic and cooperative during her previous work on Gidget, but the Flying Nun pushed her to a breaking point where she simply couldn't bring herself to promote something she found so embarrassing. Field's refusal to participate in publicity activities was particularly damaging because press interviews were a crucial part of any television star's responsibilities during the 1960s, when shows depended heavily on magazine articles and television appearances to maintain audience interest and build the careers of their leading actors. By turning down these opportunities, Field was essentially telling the entertainment industry that she didn't want to be associated with her own show, which created tension with the producers and network executives who were counting on her cooperation. The fact that Field waited until the last possible moment to learn her dialogue reveals just how disconnected she felt from the material and how little respect she had for the writing on The Flying Nun. Most professional actors spend days or weeks preparing for their scenes, studying their characters' motivations and understanding the context of their dialogue, but Field's approach suggested that she viewed the scripts as meaningless drivel that didn't deserve serious preparation. This behavior pattern showed that Field was essentially going through the motions of being a television star, while internally rejecting everything about the role that had made her famous, creating a professional crisis that could have ended her career before it really began. Fact 10. Love Struck Pelican episode became fan favorite. One of the most beloved and bizarre episodes of The Flying Nun featured a pelican named Irving, who became completely infatuated with Sister Bertrille after she helped bandage his injured leg, leading to a cross-species romance that represented the show's willingness to explore absolutely ridiculous storylines in the name of comedy. The episode, titled With Love from Irving, showed the pelican following Sister Bertrille around the convent and demonstrating his affection in the most awkward ways possible, including dropping fresh fish directly into her dinner plate during meals and bringing her seashells as romantic gifts. The storyline became even more absurd when Sister Jacqueline explained to the confused Sister Bertrille that Irving had apparently mistaken her for another pelican and had fallen deeply in love with her, creating a situation where a celibate nun had to deal with the unwanted romantic advances of a large seabird. Irving's devotion became so intense that he refused to leave the convent grounds and even went on a hunger strike when Sister Bertrille tried to reject his affections, forcing the Reverend Mother to call in a veterinarian who diagnosed the bird as suffering from heartbreak. The episode reached its climax when the vet brought several female pelicans to the convent in an attempt to cure Irving's obsession, but the lovesick bird refused to show any interest in his own species until Sister Bertrille cleverly tricked him into accepting a pelican named Emma Lou as a substitute for her affections. The episode ended with Irving and Emma Lou flying off together, leaving Sister Bertrille with a parting gift of her lost crucifix covered in sand, which she realized was Irving's final romantic gesture before moving on to a more appropriate relationship with his own kind. Fact 11. Show ranked 42 worst of all time. In 2002, 32 years after The Flying Nun ended its original run, TV Guide published their infamous list of the 50 worst television shows of all time and placed The Flying Nun at number 42, cementing its reputation as one of the most poorly regarded sitcoms in television history, despite its initial popularity and surprisingly long 3-season run. This ranking put the show in the company of other widely criticized programs like My Mother the Car, Cop Rock, and The Jerry Springer Show, demonstrating how dramatically public perception of the series had shifted since its original broadcast from 1967 to 1970. The fact that The Flying Nun earned this dubious distinction is particularly striking when you consider that the show managed to produce 82 episodes across 3 full seasons, which was actually a respectable run for a sitcom during that era, when many shows were canceled after just a few episodes or a single season. The series had initially been declared the hit of the season when it premiered, with strong ratings that suggested audiences were genuinely entertained by Sister Bertrille's airborne adventures and the wholesome comedy surrounding the Puerto Rican convent. However, by the time TV Guide compiled their worst shows list, critics and television historians had come to view The Flying Nun as a perfect example of the kind of ridiculous, gimmick-based programming that dominated 1960s television, where shows were built around supernatural premises that prioritized silly visual effects over meaningful storytelling or character development. The ranking also reflected how the show's reputation had been damaged by Sally Field's own public criticism of the series, as she had spent decades openly discussing her embarrassment about the role and her belief that the show was nothing more than mindless entertainment. Fact 12. Catholic Church served as official advisor. The producers of The Flying Nun took the unusual step of hiring the National Catholic Office for Radio and Television, known as NCORT, to serve as an official series advisor with actual on-screen credit, ensuring that the show maintained religious accuracy and respectful portrayals of Catholic life, despite featuring a nun who could literally fly through the air. This collaboration was particularly remarkable given that the show's central premise involved a supernatural ability that had no basis in Catholic doctrine or religious tradition, yet the church organization was willing to work with the producers to make sure everything else about convent life was portrayed authentically. NCORT was the television and radio counterpart to the National Catholic Office for Motion Pictures, and both organizations were responsible for monitoring and advising on how the Catholic Church and its members were depicted in popular entertainment during the 1960s. The fact that they agreed to work with The Flying Nun suggests that church officials recognized the show's generally positive portrayal of religious life and its focus on community service, education, and helping those in need, even if they couldn't endorse the flying aspect of Sister Bertrille's character. This official Catholic oversight was part of a broader effort by the producers to prevent religious criticism and ensure that the show would be acceptable to Catholic viewers, who represented a significant portion of the American television audience during that era. The strategy appears to have worked, as the series was rarely criticized by Catholic authorities and was actually favorably received by many religious orders who appreciated how the show humanized nuns and showcased their important work in education and community service. The collaboration also demonstrates how seriously the entertainment industry took religious sensitivities during the 1960s, when shows regularly consulted with religious advisors to avoid controversy and maintain broad audience appeal. Fact 13. Puerto Rico only used for opening credits. Despite being set in San Juan, Puerto Rico, The Flying Nun was almost entirely filmed in California, with only the pilot episode and the opening and closing credit sequences actually shot on location in the Caribbean island, while the rest of the series was created using sets and backlot locations at Warner Brothers Studios in Burbank. The famous San Juan convent courtyard that viewers saw in every episode was actually just the rear area of a house facade located on the Warner Brothers Ranch's suburban street backlot along Hollywood Way north of West Oak Street, creating the illusion of a tropical Puerto Rican setting while never leaving Southern California. This common Hollywood practice of location substitution was driven by budget considerations and the practical difficulties of filming an entire television series on a distant island location during the 1960s, when transporting equipment, crew, and cast members to Puerto Rico for extended periods would have been prohibitively expensive for a weekly series. Instead, the producers invested in creating one spectacular pilot episode that established the authentic Puerto Rican atmosphere, then relied on carefully designed sets and strategic camera angles to maintain that tropical feeling throughout the show's 3-year run. The opening and closing credits footage shot in Puerto Rico became some of the most important visual elements of the entire series, as they were the only genuine representations of the island setting that viewers saw week after week, creating a sense of authenticity that helped sell the premise, even though everything else was filmed thousands of miles away. This approach allowed the show to capture the beauty and exotic appeal of Puerto Rico, without the ongoing costs and logistical challenges that would have come with regular location filming, demonstrating how cleverly television producers could stretch their budgets while still delivering visually convincing results to audiences. Fact 14. Field suffered depression during filming. Sally Field has been remarkably candid about the severe emotional toll that working on The Flying Nun took on her mental health, openly admitting that she suffered from serious depression and devastating self-confidence issues throughout the show's 3-year run from 1967 to 1970. Field has described this period as one of the darkest times in her life, explaining that being trapped in a role she found humiliating and meaningless while being only 19 years old created a perfect storm of professional disappointment and personal anguish that left lasting scars on her psyche. The young actress found herself in an impossible situation where she was simultaneously experiencing career success and personal misery, as The Flying Nun made her famous and financially secure, while also making her feel like a laughingstock in the entertainment industry. Field has explained that she felt completely disconnected from the material and embarrassed by the constant jokes and ridicule that comedians and critics directed at both the show and her performance, which made her question her abilities as an actress and her future prospects in Hollywood. The depression was compounded by Field's difficult home life, as she was living with her mother Margaret Field and her volatile stepfather Jock Mahoney, a former stuntman whose mercurial temperament added stress to an already challenging situation. Field has credited this dark period with eventually motivating her to seek better training and more serious roles, as the pain of being associated with the Flying Nun drove her to work harder on developing her craft and proving that she could be a legitimate dramatic actress. However, Field has also acknowledged that the experience taught her important lessons about standing up for herself and taking control of her career, even though the immediate impact was emotionally devastating and professionally limiting. Fact 15. First American sitcom set in Puerto Rico. The Flying Nun quietly made television history by becoming the first American sitcom ever set in Puerto Rico, and remarkably, it remains the only mainstream U.S. sitcom to use the island as its primary setting more than 50 years after the show ended its original run. This groundbreaking choice brought American television audiences into a predominantly Hispanic community during an era when most sitcoms were firmly planted in white suburban neighborhoods, making The Flying Nun an unexpected pioneer in multicultural television programming during the 1960s. The decision to set the show in San Juan was particularly significant because it allowed viewers to see Puerto Rican culture, Spanish language, and Latino characters as integral parts of the storyline, rather than occasional guest appearances or stereotypical supporting roles that were more common in television at that time. The Convent Santanco served as a bridge between cultures, with Sister Bertrille as an American newcomer learning to navigate life in a Puerto Rican community, while the local characters shared their traditions, language, and perspectives with both her and the viewing audience. While the show certainly didn't provide a completely realistic portrayal of Puerto Rican life, especially given its focus on a flying nun and various supernatural elements, it still offered glimpses into a different culture and setting that most American television viewers had never seen represented in primetime programming. The series featured Puerto Rican actors like Shelley Morrison as Sister Sixto, who brought authenticity to her role as a nun, whose first language was Spanish, and who often mixed up English phrases in ways that reflected genuine bilingual experiences. This cultural representation, however imperfect, was groundbreaking for network television during the 1960s, when diversity in casting and settings was extremely rare, and most shows avoided any content that might be considered too foreign or unfamiliar for mainstream American audiences.